right, Marty, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, so I want to welcome everybody and thank you so much for joining us on this really special edition of Tenacious Live with Marty Klein. Marty is going to talk about his amazing life and career, so I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about his bio. The one thing that I did want to say is, in getting to know him really over the last couple of months, one of the things that really just sticks out to me about him is after all that he has accomplished and all you will hear about, how much of a learner and how much of a humble human being he still is. He's at every presentation, he's always asking questions, he's always connecting with divers and sonar operators and people and willing to help. And I think that there's a lot of people in the world who have accomplished a lot, but there's not that many who've accomplished so much and can still be so humble and so kind and so caring about others. So I just wanted to say that in welcoming him, and thank you so much, Marty, for being here, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Jen, and it's a tremendous honor to be here doing this virtually. We actually have friends and family literally around the world tuning in, and it's a real thrill for me, and I'm just delighted to be here. So I'm going to talk today about my mentor, my professor. 60 years ago, I was a student at MIT and I had to do a thesis. And I was about to do some very complicated thing with a whole bunch of math and equations, and math was never my strong suit. So I was wandering the halls of MIT looking for maybe to find something. And I went to this doorway. This was the lab of Professor Harold Doc Edgerton. And this is not a current picture. Thanks to Jim Bales, I have a current picture. I've been looking for an old one, but it said Harold Edgerton Strobe Lab. And I walked through this door and my life was never the same since. And so I'm going to tell you about that story, what happened to me when I went through this door literally 60 years ago. Well, let's go back to the beginning. How did I get started? I grew up in New York City. I grew up in a place called Sunnyside in Queens in a little tiny apartment. And I went to public school 150 and I rode my tricycle and I went to A.B. Davis High School and I hung around a lot in New York City. I loved the automats. I loved the trains. As kids, we were able to ride the trains and ride the subways. And I just loved it. And people say I was born with a pocket knife. I love to build things. And right from the start, it turns out my grandson in Toronto is 4 years old today, and he likes to build things. He's building trains and models and stuff. So we may have an engineer coming in the family. So in New York City, my father used to take me. There was a place called Radio Row. It was down at Cortlandt and Vesey Street. We would take the subway. It's actually the area doesn't exist anymore. It's when they built where they built the World Trade Center. But it was this amazing place with all these radio stores. And a lot of them had surplus stuff from World War II and old radar sets and audio sets and all kinds of things. And at a place called Leotone Radio, my father bought me a crystal set. And we didn't have money for the wired ones, so he bought me the kit, which was $1.95. And so I had to build it myself and wind the coils. And it had a little cat's whisker, which is a detector, and it had earphones, and it had a slider to tune it. And I was able, with that thing, I was able to, I put the ground, I hooked it to a radiator, and I put a wire out the window, and I was able to pick up WCBS in New York and listen to the radio. And that got me started in the whole world of electronics. And I started in this fascinating path. Well, somehow I got interested in electronics. I took a fascination. There were these new devices out called transistors. and they were invented at Bell Labs by Shockley and Brattain and another guy. And I took up a fascination with these. I'm not exactly sure why. In those days, equipment ran on vacuum tubes or valves, as they say in England. And I would read about these transistors, and I started building things with them. It turns out they were very expensive. It took my whole allowance to buy one Raytheon CK722 transistor. So I would get surplus parts from this radio row. I would get resistors and capacitors and various parts, and I put stuff together and I started building things. And I really got into, when I get into things, I get into them. You'll find that out about me. And I started building radios. In fact, one of the things I built an 8 transistor radio in a box with a speaker, and I actually wrote as a young kid, I wrote an article for Radio Electronics magazine, and it was called "Build the Super 8 Transistor Radio." In those days, it was like the number of gigabytes in a computer or something. It was the number of transistors was how the quality of the sonar. And I went into New York City and I met the editor of this magazine. And I'm a little guy. A lot of you have met me. I'm kind of absurdly small. And I went and met the editor and I handed him this manuscript, and he looked down and he said, Sonny, did your father write that article? And I was very insulted that I had written it. So anyway, this is my first published article in radio electronics, and I went on from there. Well, my cousin before me, we all lived together in a 2-family house, and my cousin was a very bright guy, and he went to MIT. So my goal was to go to MIT somehow or other. And one day I went to visit him at MIT, and I walked up the stairs of the main building at MIT, and there was this newspaper telling about Sputnik. And it was a shock. The Russians had put a satellite in space, and a lot of things in the country changed very rapidly. A sudden interest in technology and science, and it became an obsession with the nation. And it was just as I was coming into MIT, I got caught up in this whole world. Well, my days at MIT were amazing. It was hard. People talk about hard. I always thought I was the dumbest guy in the room. The people who I had gone to public schools, and a lot of the people there had gone to fancy prep schools, and I felt like I didn't know anything, and I worked very hard. I did, in those days, no calculators, no internet, no email, no nothing. Here's how we did our calculations on a slide rule. And there was down in New York City, slide rules were made by a place called Kufel and Esser. And I had a Kufel and Esser slide rule. And there was a guy who traveled around to our dorms, and he would engrave your name on your slide rule. So this is my old slide rule. For a while I smoked a pipe, and for a while I was a coxswain on the crew, which is incredible fun, incredible sport. They grabbed me when they saw how big I was at the beginning of the season, and they said, "You're going to be a coxswain." So this actually was the reunion row. We had about 10 years ago, we had a class reunion, and I was sitting at a dinner, and the guys came up and said, "Marty, we need you to cox the boat." And I said, "Well, I haven't driven a boat in 50 years. And so anyway, I did it. We actually won a race, and then we had a second race, and I didn't sink the boat, so I was very proud. While I was in MIT, I was a co-op student for a while. I worked in Philadelphia at a place called Philco, in this giant factory on Wissahickon Avenue in Philadelphia. And I worked on space stuff, satellite stuff. And again, no transistors are just starting to appear in the world. A lot of things are still run by vacuum tubes. And I was building high power transmitters. I was building something for a top secret classified satellite transmitter. I also worked in New York for a while at Westrex, a place right in New York City, right near Columbus Circle in New York City. And they were building a giant radio transmitter that had 1,000,000 watts. And it was there was a dummy load for the radio. There was a whole room that was just a giant resistor that would be a load to test the radio. And it was so big and powerful, they were afraid to turn it on. I don't think while I was there they ever turned the thing on, but it was some of my introduction to high power electronics and to that whole world. Well, so I'm at MIT. I'd heard about this man, Edgerton. A lot of people know about him. He was kind of a legendary character, and I had heard about him. He's famous for a lot of things. He was not the inventor of the strobe light, but he really perfected and developed the strobe light starting in the 1930s. And he's very famous for a lot of things. He's famous for these photographs of bullets going through apples and cards. He's famous for this milk drop, which is one of the world's most famous photographs, actually. And he would stop motion. He would take a strobe light. And coming into his lab, I started to learn about all this stuff. He was actually known because he worked in the Manhattan Project in World War II, and he and his colleagues figured out how to photograph an atomic bomb. So you've all seen pictures of atomic bombs, these giant things going off. A bomb, it's very, very, very short. It's very, very intense. It's very unpredictable. The amount of light is unpredictable. And so he and his colleagues figured out how to photograph these. And so every photo you've ever seen of an atomic bomb was taken by my old professor, Harold Edgerton, and his colleagues. Well, after World War II, the Atomic Energy Commission, they formed a company, Edgerton and his colleagues, Edgerton, Germeshausen, and Greer, and their job was to time and fire the nuclear explosions. And so I found myself in this company. They had a little tiny division, the Oceanographic Department, which is where I worked. But so this is what I knew about Edgerton, but coming into his world was just an incredible revelation. I also knew and had heard about a man named Jacques Cousteau. A lot of you probably have heard about. And in fact, at MIT, there was a film, The Silent World, that had a premiere. We had a lecture series committee, and they would put on films. And I saw this film, The Silent World, by this man, Jacques Cousteau, and I was amazed at it. And so I knew about these two people. Well, Edgerton, it turns out, knew about not only about strobes, but he had made underwater cameras. And the National Geographic magazine introduced Edgerton and Cousteau, and they became very fast friends. And Cousteau wanted to take pictures in the deepest part of the ocean. And so Edgerton and his technician engineer, Bill McRoberts, they made this camera rig to go to the deepest part of the ocean. And the camera hung on a nylon cable. There was no electrical connection from the camera to the boat. So they put a pinger on the camera, a precision time pinger that would send out a ping, say once a second. And the ping would go two ways. It would bounce off the ocean floor and come to the ship where they had a receiver. And it would go off the back of the pinger, and another ping would come to the receiver on the ship. And as the camera got closer to the bottom, you could follow the traces on a special graphic recorder. This was a technique that was developed by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And so as the camera got close to the bottom, you could see it, and you could set the camera off and take pictures. So Doc Edgerton and Jacques Cousteau took the first deep sea pictures ever taken. Well, Doc noticed the thing that he was using as a pinger, it was an old converted Navy echo sounder, a UQN echo sounder. It worked at 12 kilocycles, we used to call them back then, they're kilohertz now. And he noticed that the sound was penetrating the sediments on the seabed a little bit. And he became fascinated with that. This is the Sumner Tunnel on the Boston and the Callahan Tunnel that go through Boston Harbor. And this, using this pinger, this is a trace that he could get. And he started developing a device, he called it a mud penetrator. And so it was an acoustic device to look at the shallow bottom sediments of the bottom. And this is where I came into the Edgerton's lab, and I asked him if he had anything interesting to work on. Well, he was working on this thing, this mud penetrator. It was quite a contraption. It used vacuum tubes. It used an old Navy echo sounder, which Doc had filled with oil so that it would take deep ocean pressure. And it used a graphic recorder made by a company called Alden in Brockton and Westboro, Mass. It was a converted facsimile recorder. Back in the 1940s, the world thought that facsimile was going to change everything. You could transmit photos, or they call them wire photos. You could transmit weather maps, and there were these various machines. And these were the kind of crude versions of those that would transmit weather machines. And we adopted one of these recorders, and we made this device that became the famous mud penetrator. And so I would go out, Doc had his own Boston Whaler, his own boat off the sailing pavilion at MIT. And he would wake me up on a Sunday morning at maybe 5 a.m. and say, "Hey, Klein, get out of bed. We're going on the river. We got to see if the tunnels are still there in Boston Harbor." And if the old man said, "Get up and go," you got up and went. So he and I would go out, and we go back and forth in the Charles River and in Boston Harbor, and we would make these sub-bottom traces. And so that was my beginnings in sonar. And what I mentioned earlier, I had learned about transistors. The results that Doc was getting on this thing, it worked, but they were kind of lousy. The traces were fuzzy. There was a lot of noise, oscillation, hum. And well, as a kid, I mentioned I had worked with transistors. So I took out the vacuum tubes and I transistorized, they used to call it, solid state. We transistorized the mud penetrator. And I worked very hard to make the traces cleaner, better. Let me just go back a second. So the traces used to be, before I started, didn't look like this. They were very fuzzy, very hard to read. And I would succeed in making them a lot better. And Doc was pleased with what I did. And we just continued to work on these. So I worked in Doc's lab, in the strobe lab. Here I am working on the machine, and there's wires all over the place. And it was an amazing place to be there. Everyone came into the strobe lab. Everyone knew Doc. Doc knew everyone. He was just an incredible person, an incredible teacher. And it was a great blessing, and still is a great blessing for me to have worked with him. And I would go into the lab night and day, and I was obsessed with making this thing better, tuning it up, tweaking it, resoldering this, fixing that. And I just kept working on it. Well, a miraculous thing happened back there. Doc, I would work a lot of us would work in the middle of the night. Doc gave me a key to his lab. And because nowadays you probably have computer combinations and stuff, but this key became my most precious possession. So I would go to the lab anytime, night or day, sometimes 2 in the morning, and there'd be other students there working on projects. So the fact that he had faith in me, and the fact that he cared about me, it really meant a lot, still means a lot to me. Now, in the lab, there was all kinds of stuff. There was a rifle, We could shoot, you know, the pictures that I showed of bullets going through things. We could take pictures like that. There was a rifle and there were 22 bullets, and we could imagine that now, having a gun set up in your classroom. So you would come in and take pictures of balloons popping with bullets, and bullets going through apples, and all sorts of things. Well, so I started working with Doc and learning more about him, and every day was just amazing. I took his classes. He had a dark room in his lab. I learned about photography and about high-speed photography. A lot of you watching are divers. Well, Doc used the most basic diving equipment, which he had gotten from Jacques Cousteau. He also, because he was working with Cousteau on deep water equipment, he had a pressure vessel in a place called Building 20 at MIT. It was an old battleship gun shell, a 16-inch gun shell that he had converted into a pressure vessel. And he would test these cameras that he made for Cousteau in this vessel, and he would take them up to what they call full ocean depth, 36,000 feet, huge pressure. These things were 6 inches thick steel. And so right from the start, I had the honor of being able to work with equipment that could go down to the deepest parts of the planet. This is my friend, by the way, John Yules. He was my dear friend and roommate and lifelong friend. Well, Doc, just amazing working with him. He had his trademark Leica. He would travel everywhere with his handmade strobe light, and he was not only an expert in photography and in high-speed photography, he was an expert photographer. And he took the most amazing pictures, a lot of technical pictures of things in motion, but he knew the movie stars. He knew Liz Taylor. He knew Mickey Rooney. He would take pictures of movie stars. He would go to circuses and take pictures of bulls jumping. He would, and I learned sort of with him to do a lot of these photos. One of the great treats of working with him at the sailing pavilion, for a while, Philippe Cousteau, Jacques' son, was a classmate of mine. And here's Doc and Philippe working at the sailing pavilion, checking out a machine. It's a tragic story. Philippe, as some of you know, died in a plane crash. It's a just devastating story. Philippe's son is very active in the ocean world. Philippe, his son and daughter, Philippe and Alexandra, are good friends, and they're very active in ocean exploration and in ocean conservation. Here's Doc with one of my sonars. A lot of you know about the red hats. The Cousteau people wore the trademark red hat. And so Doc did a lot of work with going out with Cousteau on Calypso and going on expeditions with him. This is a book that Doc wrote, Sonar Images, and I'll tell about this image, but he used one of my images, something I was very proud of, on the cover of his book. Well, Doc introduced me to this amazing group of people called the Boston Sea Rovers. And they used to meet in Boston at various places, at the YMCA. And this is, a lot of you are divers and you're my heroes. Well, these guys, these were kind of the original scuba divers. They very early pioneers in diving. They built a lot of their own equipment. Cousteau was in fact a Boston Sea Rover. And they had a boat called the KG, and I would go out with Doc and we'd go on the KG and we would test our equipment. And a guy named Frank Scally was one of their founders, a guy named Joe Lanahan, and here's Frank at a meeting, and Joe McGinnis from Toronto, a very famous diver and ocean explorer, and Stan Waterman, another famous diver. This is at one of our clinics. So the Sea Rovers for many years would have an annual meeting. First it was at the Y in Boston. It was in various places. For a long time, it was at the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston. I would often give talks, and I would put up a little booth with my equipment. And so I got to know the Sea Rovers, and they still have an annual clinic. We couldn't do the last one, but we're hoping that this year we're going to be able to have our clinic. And at these clinics, people come, the top divers from all over the world come and they have an evening presentation where you see the best of the best of the best of underwater photography. So it's been a great honor for me to be associated for many years with the Sea Rovers. Well, I worked in Doc's lab for a while, about 6 months, and then I mentioned he had this company, Edgerton, Germashausen, and Greer, and I went to work for them. And there was a tiny little department, the oceanographic department, and we were in various places in Boston. One of the places was next to the original Radio Shack across from Boston University. One of the places was on Brookline Avenue, right across from Fenway Park in Boston. And we actually parked in the Red Sox parking lot, which was over here. It's kind of a funny story. I told you I grew up in New York City, and I had been a New York Giants fan. And the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers broke my heart. They moved out of New York and went to California. And so for many years, I literally worked across the street from Fenway Park, but I was mad at baseball and I never went to a ball game. I eventually got sucked back in and became a Red Sox fan. And so now I'm a diehard Red Sox fan. Well, I started going on expeditions, all kind of expeditions right from the start. So I would do engineering, I'd be working on things, and I'd be working on all kinds of things as an engineer. I worked on boomers and pingers and camera controllers, and we do survey work. Some of it, at some point, Doc took that mud penetrator that I showed you, and he turned it sideways, and he made a crude Sidescan sonar. And we took it various places. One, I went with Doc. We went to the Hudson River by the old Tappan Zee Bridge, which is now gone now. They built a new one. But right in the shadow of the Tappan Zee Bridge, we plotted cables going across the Hudson River. And we made another trip with Doc. We went down to Mississippi, and the Mississippi River is wild. It overflows and it meanders around, it overflows its banks. And the Corps of Engineers try to keep it in place. They make concrete revetments concrete mattresses along the side of the river, and they try to control the river. And so I went down with the Corps of Engineers. This is Earl Van Reenen, a geophysicist, and Pearl Burke, she was a geologist with the Corps of Engineers. And we had the mud penetrator on the ship, and here we are looking at the traces. And Earl was a geophysicist. There are various people who I have incredible respect for. Earl, we made these wiggles on the bottom, and Earl could look at those wiggles and see where there were revetments, where they were broken, how buried they were, and it was really an amazing journey. And then I took an interest in submersibles, submarines, research submersibles, and I got a chance to work with a lot of them. This is the Alvin. A lot of you have heard of the Alvin. This is when it was launched at Woods Hole in 1964. They've rebuilt it. This is a more modern Alvin. And I just love these things, and I was kind of good. I fit in them. Most people who go in them are twice my size, but I was able to dive in Alvin and put equipment on it. The Alvin was named for a guy named Al Vine, and one of the things I'll be talking about a little bit, I've been trying in my field to research the field as long as I've been in it. And one of the people who worked actually on Sidescan Sonar was Al Vine. the scientist, he took just like Doc, before Doc, he took an echo sounder and turned it sideways and made a crude side scan sonar. Well, I was able to take a new recorder that we built and go in the Alvin and go down about 5,000 feet off the Bahamas. And we went down, and I was able to make the first sub-bottom profile made from a deep submersible. And I guess this is 1966. And so this is doesn't look like much, but there's a historic picture. Well, Doc, at some point, I mentioned he turned the pinger sideways, and he made the beginnings of a side-scan sonar. And one of the things he did in 1963, he went out with Brad Luther and a number of other people, and he went out in Buzzards Bay, and he found the Vineyard Lightship off the coast of Massachusetts. And this is the trace. And so it's a whole story. It's one of the great finds, and a lot of publicity about it. The Boston Sea Rovers were very much involved, and I didn't like the picture, but he did find the Vineyard Lightship, and it's kind of an interesting story because to some people in the field, this is the invention of side-scan sonar, and it turns out no, it's not. I'll be talking about that, but side-scan sonar did exist. Doc didn't invent it. I didn't invent it. But what Doc did do, he was an incredible, enthusiastic guy, and he just went all around the world with this thing, and he really introduced it to the world of marine archaeology. The field was new, and he went out with all kinds of people, with Ed Link and Alicia Linder and Peter Throckmorton. And so this is a historic picture, and we later on, that picture I showed you on the cover of that book was a more modern picture that we made of the Vineyard Lightship. Well, I did other trips. I would come. It was actually a great thing that happened because we went out in the field a lot. So we made equipment, but we got out to use it and try it and put it through its paces. And then we could go back. And I would always come back from every trip and say, this equipment has to be easier to use. It has to be more rugged. It has to be more serviceable. So I would come and go on these, some of them amazing trips. I mentioned that EG&G had been formed for the Atomic Energy Commission. And we did some projects. Some of them were secret, but I talk a little bit about it. One of them was to the South Pacific. We went to, I flew to Hawaii, and I flew on a military airport transit to a place called Canton Island, out in literally in the middle of nowhere in the South Pacific. And then got on a ship, the USNS Point Barrow, and we went to Howland and Baker Island, these tiny little islands that had been sites in World War II. They had been little bases in World War II. And we weren't working at sea. We were working on land using boomers and doing sub-bottom profiling. On the ship passed the equator, and I became, there's a thing, the Navy has various rituals. And I had to go, as I was civilian, but I had to go through the ritual. And I am now not just an ordinary mortal, I am a shellback, a proud shellback of the US Navy. And I was certified by Neptunus Rex. And it was they went easy on us civilians, but it was still quite an ordeal. You had to crawl through tubes of slime, and you had to kiss the belly of the fattest guy on the ship. They greased up his belly and they shoved your face into his belly, and they put high pressure hoses on us, all kinds of stuff. So anyway, I'm a proud shellback. Well, some of you may have heard of Howland Island. A famous aviator named Amelia Earhart went down near Howland Island, and I didn't know about that at the time, but we didn't find Amelia, but we did. There were plenty of wrecked planes and wrecked boats, and we were on these deserted islands, and they were full of debris. There was boats, there was ordnance, there were planes down, there were records lying over, phonograph records draped over rocks. There were just the most incredible shells I've ever seen. There were shells bigger than me. The shore of the islands hadn't been touched, and so it was just an amazing adventure and an amazing experience. Well, then after that, we kept traveling, and again, we'd go back, we'd do some engineering, we'd do some design. One of the places we worked was the English Channel. Back in the 60s, I first went in 1964 to work on the English Channel. They were hoping to build a tunnel between England and France. The project was on again, off again for over 100 years. It actually, at one time or another, they started to drill it and they stopped. And the French and the English never really liked each other. So it would start and it would stop. But back in the 60s, there was a project to do it. And we went to survey the English Channel with sub-bottom profilers. We used sparkers, we used boomers, and this was not side scan, but we ran on the ship. We had a graphic recorder. Again, this Earl Van Reenen that I mentioned. This is the captain of the ship, Peter Morris, an amazing man, larger than life, one of the greatest captains I've ever known. We would go out for 12 hours a day and go back and forth. We were on a boat called the Fairmile. It was a long, skinny boat that had been built in World War II to attack the French coast. And so it rolled and all day, 12 hours a day, we would roll. We had a little inclinometer with a little bubble. A lot of you have seen those on a boat. Well, the little bubble would go over 45 degrees a lot of the time. And so it was quite a time. So here's a sparker. This is Doc. The ship was called the Mary Lou. And I actually lived in Dover, England for a while. And part of the time we lived in Calais in France. And so we surveyed the whole area. Well, while this was going on back at home, I was working on a small graphic recorder, a small version of the recorder for Jacques Cousteau. He had a submersible called the Soucoupe Plongette. And here it is. And we made a miniature version of the recorder to go in the Soucoupe. After that English Channel project, I actually went to try to visit Cousteau in Monte Carlo. It's an adventure for another day, but it was an incredible trip to go there. I went there unannounced, and I went to the harbor in Monte Carlo, and I looked for the Calypso. And again, it's hard to picture. This is all this stuff we did long before cell phones, long before the internet, long before email. I'm actually not sure how we communicated. You used to have to make long distance calls from sometimes in places you would book a phone call from a post office or something. But anyway, a story for another day. But I got to go to the Oceanographic Museum in Monte Carlo and got to meet the famous people who had been in the silent world, people like Falco and Lienhardt and some of the Cousteau crew. Well, I came back home, came and went on these trips. One day, working at EG&G, Edgerton, Gurma, this awful news came. The submarine Thresher, the nuclear submarine Thresher, was lost off the coast of Boston. I still shake a little bit when I see this headline. And everything changed. We became totally involved in the search for the Thresher. So by quirk of fate, I got involved in the first deep sea search that had ever happened. And the Bathyscaph Trieste, a few years before that, on January 23rd, 1960, had gone 7 miles down in the ocean in the Challenger Deep. This is the original Trieste. And the dive was made by Don Walsh and Jacques Picard. Picard is not living anymore, but Don Walsh is an amazing guy. He's still going strong. He's one of my great hero. He should be he's a national treasure. This is the Trieste is now in the museum in the Washington Navy Yard. Here I am with Don, and it was on the cover of Life magazine. This is a book that was written about it. And I became intimately involved with the Trieste. I became practically one of the crew. It was out in San Diego. This is the old Trieste. And it would be taken through the Panama Canal to Boston Harbor. And so a lot of the work was done out of Boston Harbor. A lot was done in San Diego. So I would commute to San Diego. And it's hard to see, but our sonar, I was in charge. I'm a young kid, but I was in charge of building a sonar, a side scan sonar for the Trieste, and to install it, to train the crew, to dive with it. And so there's a couple of, I don't know if you can see my mouse on the screen, but there were some transducers. There was one that looked up, that looked down, that looked to the side. We also had a hydrophone, and we had a long baseline navigation system to do the Thresher search. Well, the Trieste sonar was an adaptation of the sonar of the mud penetrator that Doc had developed. It was low frequency. It was 12 kilohertz. It had a wide beam. Well, here's the transducers in this arrow. Here I am on here's the one that looked up on the deck of the ship. We had to make this very condensed equipment. It had to go through a hatch. I think it was 18 inches diameter. So the first thing we did for a project is take a piece of plywood and cut an 18-inch hole in it. And many times I climbed up and down the ladder, up through here and down into the pressure sphere of Trieste. And I put a tremendous amount of work into the system. It did work. The sonar did work. We actually tracked targets a couple of 1,000 feet in Boston Harbor, but it failed. The sonar, when it got down in the deep sea for the Thresher search, there was a lot of geology, a lot of acoustic noise, a lot of mechanical problems, and the sonar was a failure. So I was kind of devastated, but I decided, I became obsessed with I'm going to make a sonar that really makes pictures. It doesn't just make blobs. It's going to make real pictures of the seabed. Well, I didn't know it. Again, it's before you didn't just Google things, but there were side scan sonars in the world. Some were built, they were built in various places. Some were in Germany, some were in England, some were in the US, some were in France, some were in Canada. I'm still trying, it's one of my obsessions. I'm trying to learn about the history in this field. It turns out it's very difficult because these things were all made in classified environments. And so a lot of it was just never published. There was a crew from Germany, a man named Hagemann, after World War II, was brought to Panama City, and he became a pioneer in side-scan sonar, and he helped develop a thing called the shadow graph, very high-resolution side-scan sonar. It worked over 1 megahertz, very sophisticated towfish, and then Westinghouse built these things commercially. I found out later on that a number of institutions, a number of research institutions had made side-scan sonars. This is one this is Maurice McGehee and Dwight Bogeman from Scripps Institution. This is a Navy one. There were ones on Navy ships that were called horizontal echo sounders. There were no commercial. They were all very expensive, mostly secret military things. There was in England a company called Kelvin Hughes that made a lot of echo sounders and bathymetry, and they made a single channel Side Scan Sonar. This is the first, to my knowledge, the first commercial Side Scan Sonar. It was one channel. They hung a transducer over the side. It worked at 50 kilohertz, and it did make a reasonable Side Scan Sonar record. And so these are some early, it's an unfolding story. Fortunately, with the internet, I check it several times a year, and there's more stuff coming out, but some of the history I may never find. It's just lost in history, and it's classified and may never be published. But I keep hoping to find it. It's sort of a concern of mine that people they often say that if you Google or you do Wikipedia or something, people think that Doc, my professor, invented Sidescan Sonar. He didn't, and he didn't claim to, and actually I didn't. I'll talk more about that. But I don't know precisely, did someone get the idea, and who did, and where? Well, I became, after the Trieste, after the thing didn't work and we didn't find, the Thresher was found with a magnetometer, and they did dive on it with Trieste and found there a lot of pictures of the wreckage. But I became obsessed with building a side scan sonar that would really work, that was affordable, that would make good pictures where a shipwreck would look like a shipwreck. And I worked at EG&G. A lot of my work I did with a man named Murray Bubar, one of my heroes. And we first made a single channel unit. We made our equipment battery operated because we often went on boats and often we had to carry generators along. So I tried to make my equipment so it would work on AC lines, but also on batteries. So this is a single channel unit that we made, little tiny thing. Unfortunately, this unit was lost somewhere off Alaska. It doesn't exist anymore, but it did work. It was amazing. People, you've all seen side scan images by now. Even back in 1966, we could see, this is a Stinger. It's a pipeline gadget off the coast of Alaska, and you could see every strut in the beam. So commercial sonars with high resolution have been around for a while. Well, we worked very hard on this thing, and at EG&G, I had a very small team of people. I mentioned this little oceanographic department with Murray Bubar, Fred Squires. One of my mentors was Ed Curley, who formed a company called EPC Labs. Another was Sam Raymond, who formed a company called Bentos. So I had a number of mentors. And finally, in 1967, the equipment was ready to launch, to announce to the world. And there was a convention of the Marine Technology Society in San Francisco. And they told me at EG&G that I was a lowly engineer and I couldn't go to the show. So I'm kind of a feisty guy. I bought myself a plane ticket and I went out anyway. And this is me when I had hair at the Marine, introducing at the Marine Technology Society, the original product, the EG&G dual channel side scan sonar. Well, the system was a success almost right from the start. It went out in a lot of places. I went off, and Doc went off on expeditions. I went to Turkey, and I worked on a job with George Bass, the famed undersea archaeologist, off the coast of Bodrum, Turkey. And they were looking for a statue that had been found by the fishermen in 300 feet of water. The fishermen often would find pieces of wrecks. And so they were looking for the wreck that the statue came from. And here's the harbor of Bodrum back then. Bodrum is now a modern tourist city. It doesn't look anything like that. Here's a diver chamber. And so a guy named Don Rosencrantz, who I hope is watching, and I hope I say hello to him, another one of my heroes. Don was navigating. In those days, no global positioning. We navigated with transits and theodolites and angles. There were people on the shore taking angles on the boat, and Don was following the path of the boat. Scripps had been there before me and had, with their sonar, and had gotten some targets, and Don was putting me on what he thought was the best target. And he shouted to me, keep your eye out, there's gonna be something coming up. And sure enough, it's a little hard to see in this picture, but this formation came out, and that is a historic picture. That is the first ancient ship found with a side-scan sonar. And George Bash actually had a submarine called the Ashura, and Don went diving in the Ashura along with a guy, a Turkish guy. And I don't know, a lot of you work with divers. I've worked a lot with divers. I've been down in submarines, but in a way, there's nothing worse than being on a ship when something is down, when a diver is down or a submarine is down. You don't know how they're doing, what's happening. You might or might not have a telephone connection. Well, there was a telephone on the Ashura, and all of a sudden there was a tremendous noise, and I thought, oh, I swallowed hard. Something's wrong. The submarine is in trouble. Well, it turns out Don Rosencrantz had brought a tambourine down in the submarine, and when they came upon this shipwreck, they could see a pile of an ancient amphora, and Don was banging on this tambourine, So all that noise was Don banging on the tambourine to announce they had found the shipwreck. Well, some awful news. It turns out, as I've been preparing this paper, we got word just 2 days ago that George Bass, the famed kind of the father of undersea archaeology, died a couple of days ago. Or a lot of us in the field are shocked. George was our teacher, amazing man. He formed the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M and in Texas, and he wrote a lot of books. He taught a lot of people. He introduced people to the field of underwater archaeology. He was also a great proponent in introducing technology to the field of underwater archaeology. This is an article he wrote for National Geographic magazine that told about all the different tools he used, including Sidescan Sonar, and he mentioned me in the article. And so it's a terrible loss. So this talk, I guess, is to be somewhat in memory of George. Well, so Doc went off on expeditions also, Doc Edgerton. And one of the places he went is to England, to a place, there was the ship, the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's warship. He went to work with a guy named Alex Mckee, and he brought both the Sidescan Sonar and his mud penetrator. And he went with a guy named John Mills, who was a representative from EG&G, and Bob Henderson, who worked with EG&G. And they went and they found the Mary Rose, and they did sub-bottom profiling on it. It's kind of not a great record, but they got this record. And so this is another ancient ship found with Sidescan Sonar that year. And the Mary Rose is a wonderful project. It's been raised. It was a tremendous project that was of interest all over the UK. It was on television 24 hours a day. Prince Charles got involved in the project. And they picked up a big section of it and brought it. There's a wonderful museum in Portsmouth in England. I was there a long time ago, but I understand it's come a long way, but it's an amazing museum of the Mary Rose. They take many years, they were preserving it with special materials, and it's an incredible place. Well, I kept going. That same year, later in the year, I went with Doc Edgerton to Israel. And we worked with a man named Elisha Linder. one of my dear friends, Elisha was the founder of marine archaeology in Israel. And here he is. And also on the trip was Peter Throckmorton. A lot of you have heard of, one of the world's great marine archaeologists. And here's Doc Edgerton. And here's me and Joan Throckmorton. And we were looking, in this case, we were using a sub-bottom profiler, not a side scan, but we were looking for an ancient harbor that was reputed to be an ancient harbor off the coast of Ashdod. And so we were out there every day pinging and doing sub-bottom work and finding outcrops. And one of the things about a place like that, you find things all the time. We found these ancient anchors, stone anchors, we found pottery, we found all kind of things. And there's a lot of, since then, there's a lot of undersea archaeology has been done in Israel. There's Elisha set up an institute, and I'm sort of out of touch, but a lot of things are there to be found. One of the things, Elisha used to dream of finding a Phoenician ship. And one day they did. Elisha lived in a kibbutz called Magan Mikhael near Haifa. And right off the coast, I don't have pictures of it, but right off the coast, they found an ancient ship. It turned out to be a Phoenician ship. It was like a dream come true. And a lot of work has been done on that, a lot of excavation. Well, it's 1967. It's the end of 1967. I'm probably going to go over time. I'm going to do some skipping around from here on. So if any of you have to leave, we are recording the show and you will be able to look at it. And I've also been advised that Grey's Anatomy is back on air tonight. So if you have to go watch, you can continue at another time. Well, I had been on all these trips, and I mentioned that I had worked at Edgerton's company, and I loved it there. I loved the company, but they were growing, and there were a lot of problems. They had become a big glamour New York Stock Exchange company. We were a teeny little division, and I was always battling for funding, there were a lot of issues. And so I was very reluctant to leave, but I did decide that year, I'm going to go off on my own. And in a bit of madness, I formed a company, Klein Associates. I was literally I was living in Lexington, Massachusetts in a tiny little rented cottage. And I started this little business, and I literally had I was literally in the basement, like the cliche, and I had a drafting board in my bedroom, and I started drawing things. And I started off, I did some consulting, I started designing equipment, and I had big plans. I really didn't know, I had no schooling in business. I didn't really know what I was doing. In those days, there was very little. I did take some business courses, but learning about small business, if you took a business course, they told you about General Motors or Ford or something. There was very little to learn about small business. So I really learned the hard way about most everything. I knew I needed some kind of water to test when I made equipment. I looked all over the coast around Boston, but I never found anything I could afford. I wound up buying an old lumber yard in Salem, New Hampshire. And it was a place called the Atkinson Lumber Company, and they were going out of business, and they auctioned off the place. And I set up my office in this little building, which was the only place that had heat in the building. And I began to build and build and build and build. And so the company is still there. It's they just had I think a 53rd anniversary just recently, and the building, we just kept adding on it and adding on it. This is when I left it in 1989, and we built two giant test tanks. One of them is in this building, so we could test our equipment. We joke about this. The people joke about New England, living in New England. Sometimes the snow got really high, and I had a dog who I adopted in the area. He became my mascot, and the company is still going. It's called. It's on its third owner. I actually sold it back in 1989, and it's called Klein Marine Systems, and they're still doing great things and working on a lot of interesting stuff. Well, I want to mention, I'm talking a lot about myself here, but I didn't do anything I'm telling you about by myself. I had help. I had tremendous, through my life, I've had mentors, I've had people to work with, and people often say, I did this, or I did that. I had help. I had a lot of help. And a person I'd like to mention, another of my heroes, a guy named Fred Squires. I had met him at EG&G. He was my first person I hired at Klein Associates. He had something like an 8th grade education, and in World War II, he went into the Navy and he worked in the engine room on a destroyer. And Fred was this amazing man. He could build anything, fix anything, do anything. And on weekends, he was in the Naval Reserve. He would fly in the P2s and the P3s, and he would say, "Oh, going to Spain for the weekend." He would fly in the Navy Reserve and look for Soviet submarines. I knew that he had gone on a trip because if I came in on a Monday morning, there was a bottle of wine that he had bought that he got from the PX in Rota, Spain, and just an amazing man. I miss him terribly. Well, we try to make money doing business. Sometimes we were good at it, sometimes we weren't. But money was hard. Running a small business is hard. You're often broke. Getting financing is very difficult. But so everything was on a shoestring for many years. But we persisted. We kept going, and we had our ups and downs, but the company is still going strong. I want to mention, people often ask me, what is the biggest development in your field since you started? And it turns out the biggest development in our field is not sonar, it's navigation. In the early days in this field, there were some kind of crummy radio navigation. But we did some of our surveys with this is in Loch Ness, with hand-bearing compasses. This is George Reed, and we're looking at targets on the shore. We're using theodolites. On the English Channel Tunnel project, we use something called decahyfix. And this is kind of a fun story. I'm an old engineer, and when I mentioned that I traveled a lot. And when you travel, it was expected, if you're an engineer, you got to run and fix everything on the boat. So here I am running the decahyfix. So I had to fix everything, anything electronic, the echo sounder, the radio, the hyfix. Well, this decahyfix was an amazing thing. It used hyperbolic navigation, and we would run 12-hour days going back and forth, running survey lines. And at the beginning of the day, we would read 2 little dials, and there'd be 2 numbers. And we'd go out for 12 hours. And when we came back to the dock, those 2 numbers had to be the same that they were in the morning. And if they weren't, the entire day's work was thrown out. It only happened to us once, but it was really tough. So the big change in our field is global positioning, and you can have both global positioning now in your iPhone in your pocket, and it's made a tremendous difference in the field. Well, shipwrecks, a lot of shipwrecks over the years. A lot of you have seen shipwrecks. One of my other heroes in this field is a guy named Gary Kozak, who worked with me for many years, and we went out together. He went out on his own a lot in the Great Lakes and in many other places. And so pictures like this They're still amazed, a lot of people, but we've been making shipwreck pictures for a long time and some really good ones. This is one Gary made in the Great Lakes a long time ago. Well, another famous wreck, I'm going to be jumping around a little bit now. In Lake Ontario, there are two ships from the War of 1812, the Hamilton and the Scourge, and these were found by the Canada Centre for Inland Waters, and Ken McMillan, and they used our sonar back then. This is a historic picture because it shows the Hamilton. In the Great Lakes, ships are very well preserved, and the Hamilton is sitting right, standing up. And with Sidescan Sonar, you get something called an acoustic shadow, and the shadow will often create a lot of detail on the sonar image. And in this case, the masts were standing on the ship, and there were bones on the deck. You can see some of the railing on the ship. So both of these ships were very much intact, and there were literally bones. So this is one of the great shipwreck finds ever made. Well, other places, I did worked a lot of places. One of them was Loch Ness. I had a lawyer friend of mine, a man named Bob Rhines, who had an obsession with the Loch Ness monster. And he invited me back in 1970 to go bring my sonar to see if we could find the Loch Ness monster. And we did go, it's a whole long story for another day. We didn't really find the monster, but we found other things. We found shipwrecks, we found a number of things. And one of the things, one year, we were working 12-hour days, and one year, a guy named Charlie Finkelstein and I were back home looking at the records, and we saw this fuzzy picture of what looked like a twin-engine plane. And we asked the locals, it was in Drumnadrochid in Scotland, we told them we had found this plane, and one of the people there told us that a PBY, a Catalina, had gone down in that area. And I went back 2 years later with Tom Cummings and Gary Kozak, and we made a much better picture of the plane. And we gave that picture to Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. And it turns out we found something called Arthur Robert. It's called the Loch Ness Wellington. It's a whole long story, but the Heriot-Watt brought ROVs, and they took pictures of the airplane. And the airplane was raised by Oceaneering. A friend of mine, Joe Zazinski, was there. And the plane was brought to a place called Brooklands in Weybridge, about an hour from London. And these are a couple of books about it. I visited years ago. Here's a gun turret from the Wellington. And there's a project going on. I've been on it in the past year. There's a group of people who were involved. The Wellington Bomber was a very famous aircraft designed by Barnes Wallis. It had a geodesic structure. And this Wellington we found is the only one that actually flew that's been found. There are a lot of them. They were in very difficult battles. And I've been working with this group, and this is a sneak preview. They're about to launch on the banks of Loch Ness a new plaque memorializing the discovery of Arthur Robert. And there's this group, if you take down this email address or look at this image, you can look them up. So there's a project going on to memorialize one person died in the Wellington, but there was a lot of people who flew Wellingtons. And so there's a wonderful project to memorialize these brave people who flew in these aircraft. Well, another thing I got involved in over the years, I've always liked to use several sensors together. So I got involved in multi-sensor towfish that had sonars and sub-bottom profilers and echo sounders and cameras and videos and so forth. This is the one that actually found the Thresher back in on the Mizar. This is the one built by Bob Ballard that was used for the Titanic. We actually at Klein Associates, we made a beautiful thing called a Smartfish at one time for this purpose. Well, I got a chance to work with Bob Ballard. You all know about the Titanic search. Bob had one of our sonars, and he had it mounted on the Argo vehicle. And it's a whole long story also for another day, but they were looking, there was a French group looking for Titanic, Ifremer, and then Bob and his crew went looking for Titanic. And they, after all the work they were doing, Bob had the idea that what they needed to do is look for the debris field, not just the ship. So in the middle of the night, they picked up on the sonar the debris field. And this actually, it doesn't look like much, but this is a historic picture. This is the find of the Titanic, this sonar record. It's not a very good picture. Unfortunately, those deep multi-sensor fish wiggle a lot. And so the picture is not very clean. But this is the find of Titanic. And shortly after this, they picked up the boiler, came up on the video, this wonderful round boiler, and it was a very momentous find. And of course, you all know the history. They actually made it, the movie Raise the Titanic. The book was written by our friend Clive Cussler, and it premiered in Boston. And I took all the employees at Klein, and we went to see the premiere of the movie. Another ship I was very much involved with was the Monitor, the ironclad man named John Broadwater. Doc Edgerton actually went out with the sonar and Duke University, and they found the Monitor with the side scan. And under John's direction, they managed to raise the gun turret of the Monitor, and that's at the museum in. It's still under preservation, but it's up on shore now. Another project thing I've been honored to be involved with is in Lake George, a man named Joe Zarzinski, a dear friend. He was working for years in Lake Champlain and in Lake George, and using the sonar, he found a number of ships. And one is actually the oldest American warship. It's called a Radeau. It's a funny looking thing. It looks like a stealth bomber, but it's wood. Here's a model of it that was recently made and a sonar picture of it. And here's Joe and Vince Capone and the group that found the Radeau. We also went to England, a place called Bridlington, to look for John Paul Jones' ship, the Bonhomme Richard, and we did that work with Clive Cussler, the famous author. Here's Clive with Sidney Wignall, the archaeologist, and here's me and Clive. Unfortunately, we lost Clive not long ago, but they still haven't found this. There's some ships that never get found. There've been a lot of searches for Bonhomme Richard, but it still has not been found. So we're hoping one of these days. Another ship I've been involved with is the Portland, right off the coast of Boston. And they call this the Titanic of New England. And this was found by John Fish using sonar some years ago. I'm involved these days with the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. And the Portland is in the Marine Sanctuary, and they've been doing a lot of work with it. There was a whole project the last couple of years with Calvin Myers and with Woods Hole to photograph the Portland, and they're doing a lot of archaeology work to study it. Another thing we found is Gary Kozak, who I mentioned, found the 09 submarine just off the coast of New Hampshire. Well, coming to the end of the road here, people ask me what's coming. Well, I think a lot. That the whole world has changed so much. When I started out, we were using vacuum tubes. Eventually we used transistors, but it was, when I started out, it was long before computers, long before microprocessors. But the world has come a long, long way, and I think we've come a long way with these sonars. But I feel like that's going to continue. Our imaging, it's good, but it still could be a lot better. I feel like we're going to be seeing three-dimensional images of things. One of the areas that's still lacking, we can do sub-bottom work, but we can't make an image. If a wreck is buried, We can't truly make a 3D image of it yet, but I think we'll be doing that. There's a lot of controversy about the excavating a shipwreck is very difficult, very dangerous, very expensive. So we're hoping as the technology improves, we're making better pictures of these wrecks so they can be studied digitally. And we can even, there's actually things now where 3D printing is done of the wrecks, and a lot to be done. So what's left to find? Well, a lot. There's a cliche about the ocean is whatever, 70% or 75% of the Earth, and only a tiny fraction has really been explored, and even tinier fraction has been explored in detail. So we're going to find, and we still find, lots of ships, old and new. There are harbors and cities. There's maritime history to be found. There are new animals. There's a lot in the ocean still to find. One of my hopes is that this is kind of before the monitor. This is a Korean armored ship called a turtle ship, Geobunsen. And one of these days, we're going to find one of these. We're going to find ships that are where they're not supposed to be. I still owe my old professor, Edgerton, that we're going to find a Viking ship off the coast of Boston. And so one of you, when you're out one day, keep your eyes out. We're still going to do it. There's also, we're reminded once in a while, this is the Antikythera device that was found off the coast of Greece. It was a very complex mechanical calculator. And a friend, Brendan Foley, has been studying the ship that this came from. But you have to wonder, there must be other things like this under the sea. There must be, this wasn't the first of these ever built. There must be newer ones, older ones. So still a lot to find in the ocean. There's also creatures. There are so-called extinct creatures. I've done looking for monsters, but there really are creatures everywhere, in freshwater, in rivers, and in deep water. And people are finding creatures all the time on these deep water expeditions. One of the things that's been a great joy to me in the last recent years, there's a program I want to mention called MATE, Marine Advanced Technology Education. I got involved with it when they were at MIT. It's an ROV competition where kids come from all over the world and they make remote operated vehicles. They're not from kits, they make them from scratch. They're assigned different things. And I've gotten to be I was a judge for many years and kind of a mentor. It's a program that's brought me a lot of joy over past years. These kids from MATE come from everywhere. They're from Australia and Germany and Mexico and Russia and India and Canada and France and Germany, and they're just there's a lot of problems in the world, but whenever I go to one of these competitions and work with these kids, I feel hopeful that the world has a future. There's some amazing people out there, and it's a real joy. I also had a chance some years back. I mentioned Bob Ballard. Bob and I go back many years. Bob managed to, after he found the Titanic, he had a lot of fame, which well-deserved, and he got himself his own ship, the EV Nautilus, and I had a chance to go out with him a few years ago. And I'm very proud of Bob. He's become a tremendous educator. He's encouraged students, many hundreds of people have gone out on Nautilus, and they go out on these incredible expeditions and find things and find creatures. And that's an ongoing thing where just an amazing amount of people have come out of that program and doing wonderful things. Another thing I'm very proud of, we're getting towards the end, is for years to survey harbors in the world, they used to do something called wire drag. They would take two boats and drag a wire between them, and they would hang on a ship. And this was a very dangerous, difficult operation. And we managed to replace a lot of that stuff with Sidescan Sonar. Another thing, a recent find that I'm very proud of, there are certain ships that are like, to me, the holy grails. The Titanic was one. One was the Erebus and Terror from Franklin's expedition in Canada. And the Erebus was found a few years ago with a side-scan sonar. And it was actually announced by the Prime Minister of Canada, one of the great finds. There's also something I've been involved with. I'm trying to get these things preserved. And so I've managed to get sonars involved in museums around the world. There's one in the Science Museum and the Mariners Museum and the MIT Museum and the Clive Cussler Museum and a number of others. I'm also very much involved with the MIT Museum. I'm on the collections committee, and I've managed to snare for them a whole bunch of sonar equipment. There's something very exciting going on at MIT. They're building a new MIT museum, and it's almost ready. It's in Kendall Square, right by the subway stop, and it's coming soon. And it's going to be a whole new home for this wonderful museum, including their collection of oceanographic equipment and autonomous vehicles and Klein Sidescan Sonar. Well, people ask me, what should they do? Should they have a career in oceanography? Of course you should. It's easy. You just go out in a ship and, put the equipment over the side and you can do it. Well, I'm going to wrap up. I have a lot of thank yous. A lot of people I mentioned have helped me over the years. So I won't name them all, but I want to thank a lot of the people who've helped me in my career and with this talk and with this work. I want to thank the RV Tenacious, also some of my heroes, the amazing people. They're the ones who invited me tonight, and their ship, and they're doing wonderful things, and they keep doing them. And what's wonderful is they're sharing it with the public with shows like this, and so I'm quite proud of these folks. And so one of my mantras that I talk to the mate kids about is, I don't like to be satisfied. I make a point of not being satisfied. Wherever I go and I see a situation, I like to, instead of just criticizing, I like to say, how can we work together and make this better? So it's something that I hope you'll take on. And so finally, I want to thank my professor, the amazing Harold Edgerton, my friend, my mentor, my teacher. I will always consider myself to be one of his students, and I'm very grateful. So thank you for listening, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. And the comments are just full of people talking about what an inspiration you are and what an incredible presentation that was. I don't know if anybody's got any questions. Did you see?
No, I didn't see any questions. Everybody's saying thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. See, you did a great job.
We did have one question coming in from Facebook, and if I'm turning this way, it's because the Facebook screen is up here, so I can see who's commenting there. And somebody had a question about if you did any work at the Naval Underwater Systems Center in New London, Connecticut, or Newport on your sonar systems research. And they said specifically with towed buoy systems and sonar systems.
I'm not muted. Yes and no. I know a lot of those people. They've done amazing things. I did not do a lot of work directly with them, but they've done amazing things in the sonar. I mentioned the history. I'm still trying to learn the history. A lot of the history is right here in New England with them and also with Raytheon. And so I didn't really work much with them directly, but they've done they are pioneers in this field, and a lot to learn from them.
Great. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. It doesn't look like, I think I can't believe that you could have answered everybody's questions, but I'm not seeing any other questions coming through. Somebody wants to know if there are any juicy problems that you're obsessively thinking about.
All the time. All the time. One of the things I greatly regret, I had my business and it was some success, but I got tired of, I got away from the technical side a lot. I was spending my days with bankers and lawyers and personnel problems and everything but engineering. I had great engineers work for me, but there's still a lot of things about the ocean that puzzle me. I feel we can do a lot better, and I actually needle there's a new group of people at Klein Marine Systems, and I've made it a point to be an annoyance to them. I bug them about how they're going to make a better system. So yes, I think we can do a lot better, and I've been honored for many years to be involved with MIT Sea Grant. I see Chris Chrysostomidis is here, and they have just done amazing things with a lot of things, but they're pioneers on autonomous vehicles, and there's a way more to be done in that field. So yeah, I have technical things that bug me all the day. Another person I see in the group here is Charlie Mazel, a dear old colleague. Charlie's become an expert on underwater imaging and fluorescence and just fascinating work. I don't feel we're doing enough I did a lot of work with Doc with photography, but I feel like there's a lot more to be done. I don't know if she's here, but there's an amazing lady, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Daria, who is doing work bringing color out from a lot of underwater pictures are all washed out, and she's done this amazing work bringing color back into the photography. So there's a lot to be done, and I'm still very, very excited about the field. I'm honored to be in it, but I don't think we've touched the surface.
Someone was asking about getting started. Like, what would you recommend if somebody wanted to get started doing sonar in terms of systems to get started with?
Well, people ask me a lot. I got started by accident, as I told you. It's kind of cliche, but what I tell people is never graduate. If you're going to do good work in the ocean, you got to know a lot of subjects. You got to know math and physics and computers and photography and environmental things, and you got to know how to keep alive on a boat. You got to know how to tie a knot. You got to know how to stay okay when you fix things while you're bouncing around on the rolling sea. So learn all you can, and so if you finish school, you get whatever, a degree or a master's degree or a doctorate degree. Keep studying, because there's a lot to learn. So I think, but find a niche. There's a lot of areas you can work with, a lot of different things, with biology, with sonar, with engineering, with oil company work, with deep sea mining, with archaeology, with dredging. There's a lot of things that can get you hooked up in the ocean. So try to get yourself out on the boat. Try to find mentors. Try to find people and shadow them in their labs. And there's a lot of magazines, and of course nowadays there's tons of YouTube stuff. So I hope you find your way with it.
Somebody just asked if there are any imaging systems that don't exist but you dream about.
Yes. Well, there's still, the stuff we have, it's only okay. The sonar pictures, photography is still way better than sonar. Sonar is a lousy medium. The speed of sound in water is very slow compared to light. Sound gets bounced around and attenuated and bubbles. And so one of the things that I hope, I'll tell you one, you can see me on the screen, and I can see you, because we have the good fortune to have eyes, and we've evolved with these miraculous things called eyes. But I always wonder if there are other senses that we don't have receptors to pick up. We know that there are some things like dolphins and bats, and there are creatures that have a variety of sensors. There, for instance, there's creatures that fluoresce, and we don't exactly know why. So right in the air where you're sitting and I'm sitting, there are radio waves, there are TV waves. We wouldn't know those were there if we didn't transmit them. We had a receiver. So I feel maybe there are other senses, other things, other parameters we haven't evolved to detect. It's kind of far-fetched, but there are a lot of bright people out there. So yes, there's a lot to still do and still find.
And I think the last question is, what is your next trip or adventure? What is the next adventure that you have planned or would like to do?
Well, I'm going to turn 80 soon. I don't get on boats much anymore, but I still hope to still find things, still do some traveling. We still have to find that Viking ship for Doc Edgerton, and I have hobbies too, and so one of my other adventures is to display a bonsai tree in the National Bonsai Exhibition coming up later this year. I see Katie. Hello, Katie. I see a lot of you. This is kind of George Buckley and Stan Reinhold. Stan is, you can see him on the screen, is one of the old timers. He's now president of the Bathyscaph Trieste Alumni Association. Ralph Wilbanks is here, finder of the Hunley, an old partner with Clive Cussler. John Broadwater is here. Arthur Ganson is here. Steve Ball. I can only see some of you on the screen, but it's really thank you for this, Steve, Captain Steve Ressler, and there's Sharon Magnuson, my partner in crime, and so it's wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thanks all of you for being here. This was amazing. And the people are asking about the presentation. So it's available on our Facebook page because we've been streaming to Facebook. So if you want to replay it or download it, you can get it there or share it onto any sites or pages that you may have. You can share it from our page. I put it in the chat. And while you're at it, if you like, give us a like or a follow. You can stay tuned on all our adventures this season using our Klein system. So we're hoping to be able to send you a lot of images over the next year, over this next dive season.
Excellent.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Marty. You are an inspiration, really.
Thank you so much.
Good seeing everybody.
Stay well, Marty.